Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our services, if we can please kindly turn off all cell phones or electronic devices, or please place them on silent. Thank you.
Shalom, everyone. I am Gary Gans, the Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Beth Tikva in Marlton. I'm sad but honored to be with you here today as we acknowledge the death of Bob Greenberg. As I explained in a moment ago, the ceremony actually began with the tearing of the ribbons that are worn by the immediate mourners. Larry and Teddy wear them on their left-hand sides. Through the bad biology teaching 2,000 years ago, and we thought the heart was on the left, it's now more centered. But at the loss of a parent, this ribbon that is torn represents that loss of a parent. And Gail is wearing hers on the right-hand side, as has been the several thousand-year custom for a spouse. Equally torn, equally only worn for a short period of time. Traditionally, by the way, those ribbons are worn for a full 30 days following the funeral. But because of the imminent arrival of Passover, which ends the mourning, at least externally, internally, it may go on for a while. That would be the last day, the morning of the Seder, when if the ribbon is being worn, even by someone who's very, very traditional, that would end it early. Ma'ayan HaChayim, God who is the wellspring of life. We've come together sharing our sorrow to commemorate the life of Bob Greenberg. We recall the blessings of his life. We thank God for all that was good and true, and for the precious memories which shall endure. Eternal God, his family, bowed in grief, seek light to dispel the dark gloom which threatens to overwhelm them. Be gracious to those who mourn, for they are in distress. Bless them with your compassion. Ease their burden of sorrow. Send them light and peace, for it is written, "Fear not, as I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I'll sustain you with my power." And let us say, Amen. We also want to extend, as a community of consolation, our concerns for his grandson, Will, who's also representing that generation of Beatrice, Henry, and Zoe, and not to exclude Jeff, the official son-in-law. I also want to acknowledge that Gail's brother and sister-in-law, that's Joseph and Judy, are also interred at the same military cemetery, where after these proceedings are finished, we'll be taking Bob there as well in Arneytown. That's the Brigadier General William Doyle Veterans Memorial Cemetery. I offer on his behalf Psalm 23, an excerpt in Hebrew and then an English interpretation. Mizmor de David, Adonai ro'i lo echsar, bin nodesha yarbitzeni, al mei menuchot yenachaleni. Nefesh yishovev, yancheni b'magle tzedek, lema'an shemo. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He has me lie down in green pastures. God leads me beside the still waters and guides me on paths of righteousness. God revives my soul for the sake of God's glory. Though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your staff and your rod do comfort me. You set the table in sight of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall abide in the house of the Lord forever. I have a favorite funereal statement. A text written several thousand years ago by a rabbi and scholar named Ben Sirach. I share with many members of my congregation, my own family, my own parents, right here at the same pulpit. Ben Sirach understood the realities of life, the closure of death, and the completeness that comes from that moment. I offer his writing in translation to English so that it's understood and felt deeply. He wrote, "We are all destined to die. We share with all who ever lived, with all who ever will be. Cry for the dead. Hide not your grief. Do not restrain your mourning. But remember that continuing sorrow is worse than death. When the dead are at rest, let their memory be a source of peace, and be consoled when the soul departs. Death is better than a life of pain, and eternal rest is better than lingering illness. Let us not seek to understand what is too difficult for us, nor search for what is hidden, nor be preoccupied with what is beyond, for we have been shown more than we can comprehend. As a drop of water in the sea, as a grain of sand on the shore, are our few days in eternity. The good things in life last for a short time, but a good name, a good reputation, endures forever." You had a sense of joy upon seeing each other today. That was wonderful. As well as the gravitas and the sadness of this moment. And that full spectrum of emotion is exactly why we are here, creating a cathartic moment that allows us to understand the full reach of the human experience. I share with you from the book of Ecclesiastes that explains and understands as well that sense of power that comes from living life. For everything there is a season, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Indeed, this is a moment to speak and to share. And I'm honored first to call on Larry to come up to join us here on the pulpit.
First, thank you all for coming today. It means a lot to us. It means a lot to my mother. Can you hear? Can you hear better? No. Martha can translate. Right. You know there's a copy made in general. But thank you all really for coming. I think it's a tribute to your support and how you feel about my mother, but also my father. And just hearing, some brief stories from some people, how much my father, meant to them, means a lot. When I talk about Bob Greenberg, and I was thinking about this, the immediate response is to smile. Because whether he was a husband, a father, a friend, a coworker, he always made you smile and he made you laugh. And at first, that might seem like a very strange thing to say because people often thought he was an irritable man, a cranky man, maybe a little cantankerous, a bit of a curmudgeon. Two of his favorite expressions, which when my wife first heard made her wonder what she had married into, were that people were either whack jobs or nut jobs. And when he would read the Inquirer and New York Times every morning, he would sigh and say, people are slime. But beneath all that, the truth is that he actually loved people. And it's what made him such a generous person with his time. It's what made him have so many friends, which made him really love talking to people and interacting with them. But of all the people he truly loved, it was those people that, I guess you'd call them a little idiosyncratic. He loved people that did things differently, that had their peculiarities, that had their quirks. He admired their great feats of antisocial behavior. He loved the way they marched to their own beat. And he fully appreciated that independent nature that was in their heart. There was no greater compliment in his mind than to be that type of person. And he would constantly regale us with stories of people he met, with his friends and acquaintances, and how interesting a person they were. And he laughed loudly as he'd tell these stories. And to those of you that are his close friends, you might want to re-examine your own life and see how you fit into that paradigm. But really, I think what's interesting to me is I'm not sure he ever really looked at himself and his own peculiarities and really thought that he himself was a story. And it really started at a young age. His cousin Beatrice, or Cousin B as he called her, and they were 6 months apart and both lived in the Bronx, New York. She would tell stories of little Robert Greenberg as a young boy at elementary school with his flaming red hair. When he would get angry, he would storm off to his room and slam the door so loudly that the entire apartment building in the Bronx would shake, and all of the people in the building and the neighbors would say, "Oi, there goes Bobby Greenberg." Or his interesting beliefs that clothing, like fine wine, needed to be aged for several years, maybe even a decade, before you wore them, meaning that he never had anything that was up to date or stylish, but he didn't really care. And to this day, in his closet are dozens of shirts and pants that are still in the shrink wrap. Or the feats of military prowess that he showed when he was inducted into the Army in 1953. And there are many such stories of his military prowess, but I'll only cite one because he is being interred into a military cemetery, and I don't want them to rescind that. But when he was in boot camp and he was in his barracks, which was part of actually a Southern National Guard unit and had a rather sadistic sergeant, the sergeant made all of the men pull all the cots and footlockers and mattresses out of the barracks and gave them all toothbrushes and made them go in and scrub every inch of that with a toothbrush. Well, Bob Greenberg was not going to do that. So he went outside and he sat on a footlocker. And when the sergeant came back to inspect the work, he went up to him and said, "What are you doing there? Why aren't you in there scrubbing that barracks with the rest of the men?" And my father stood up, saluted, and said, "Sir, I am guarding the men's equipment, sir." And the sergeant looked at him and said, "Carry on, soldier." And that was the start of many, many feats and stories in the military, none of which truly involved combat. Or my father's obsession, as we all who live with him know, over drafts. "Gail, can you close that door? Will, can you close that door behind you? Is there a window open? I feel a draft." There was always a draft. Or his other obsession with glares from lights. "It's 4 o'clock, Larry. Can you shut off that light and turn on this light? There's a glare." "Gail, can you close that light? I see a bit of a glare." To the point where sometimes we would sit in the dark because there was an infinitesimal amount of glare still left in the room. For some reason, he didn't like glare. Or when he started to wash the clothes and do the laundry to help my mother, which may have ended up being a mistake, not because he shrank all her clothing and she banned him from washing her clothing, but also he took to washing towels for the pool to the point that in his world, the minute you used a towel, it had to be washed in the washer and dried or it would immediately get mildew. In the middle of using it, he would snatch it away from you. And to dry yourself off, you'd have to go hide in a different room before he took the towel. I could go on for hours with Bobisms because he was that interesting, fascinating man. But I think my favorite of all was his creative ways of applying analysis to everyday life. He essentially invented life hacks before they became known as such. For example, my favorite, and I've told this story before, was I was in his bedroom one day, and this was when he was still commuting into the Philadelphia Inquirer every day, and on his dresser, which was immaculately neat, he had 5 stacks of coins, and I was looking at them, and he saw me looking, and he said, "Well, that's a long story, but I think you can appreciate it." And I think he said, "I think you can appreciate it," with a little bit of fear that I would appreciate it, but also a lot of pride in what he had developed. Because my father had calculated the perfect algorithm for the mixture and number of coins you need to put in your pocket every day before you set off for work. Too many coins, and you would create a hole in your pocket over time, and then someone would have to sew it. So we figured out you needed 2 quarters, and you can write this down, 1 dime, 2 nickels, and 3 pennies. And that was the optimum mix of coins to get you through every work day. And when he'd come home from work, he would empty his pockets and dump them in a bowl, which was on his dresser. And every Sunday night, out of that bowl, he would set up 2 quarters, 1 dime, 2 nickels, 3 pennies, and 5 stacks that he could then use through each of the days. Bob Greenberg was a marvel. And more than anything, he was the thing he prized most in other people. He was a true character. And we will miss him a lot. We love him very much, but he will keep us smiling and laughing.
I'm now honored to call up Teddy.
First of all, thank you to everyone attending for your love and support of both of my parents all through the years. Today, we gather to say goodbye to a man who was more than just a father to me. He was my role model, my guide, and my life coach. As I stand here before you, reflecting on the life of my father, I cannot help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the lessons that he imparted upon me. My father was a man of many qualities, each of which left a permanent mark on those fortunate enough to have known him. Today, I want to share with you 6 valuable lessons I learned from him, lessons that have shaped me into the person that I am today. First and foremost, my father taught me to be kind to others. Deep down beneath his sometimes gruff exterior, he possessed a heart of gold. He always went out of his way to counsel a friend in distress or help me feed a stray animal in our yard, against my mother's cautionary advice, of course. Secondly, he instilled in me the importance of hard work and doing things right the first time. He always said, if you can't do it right the first time, then don't bother doing it at all. As an editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer, he approached his work with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that every word was just right, and he expected the same from his team and his children, not so much appreciated when trying to crank out a last-minute paper, I might add. He carried the same exacting approach to his pride and joy, the lawn. I can remember many weekend afternoons raking the fallen foliage and brush, only to watch him walk the perimeter of the house, pointing out the leaves and twigs I had missed, and me wondering if the chore would ever be completed. Nonetheless, his dedication to excellence was truly inspiring, and it is a value that I continue to carry with me in everything I do. And unfortunately, that includes my own lawn. Another lesson my father taught me was the importance of keeping your commitments. He was a man of his word, someone you could always rely on no matter what. His integrity and reliability were unmatched, and I strive to emulate those qualities in my own life. Although at the time, I did not appreciate having to turn down my social plans with friends for obligatory school commitments. My father always taught me to be prepared. He had a plan in place for whatever life threw his way. Like the way he meticulously lined up his coins in vertical piles on his dresser each night before bed. When questioned on the reason behind this odd ritual, he replied that he didn't like carrying a lot of loose change in his pockets all day, and that he had determined the exact amount of each coin he would use in a day, and that lining it up on his dresser each night would give him quick access to it each morning. This was followed by the daily routine of folding 2 tissues into quarters and placing them in his shirt pocket before departing for work. Of course, I have my own time-saving rituals for maximum efficiency. His lessons have served me well, reminding me to anticipate the unexpected and approach the day's challenges with a cool head and a steady hand. One of my father's greatest loves was the outdoors. Whether he was hiking through the mountains in Colorado or scrambling up what we called the mountain, now known as Mount Laurel State Park, and with us kids and our dog Snoopy, he found solace and joy in nature's beauty. His love for the outdoors was infectious, and he passed that passion on to me, teaching me to appreciate the wonders of the natural world and the importance of preserving it for future generations. Finally, my father had a deep and abiding love for animals, from our beloved basset hound Snoopy to his future 4-footed grandpets, to his love for endlessly watching veterinary programs on TV until his last days on Earth, and thank you, Dr. Pohl. He treated every living being with kindness and respect. His compassion for animals reflected his gentle spirit, and it is a lesson that has stayed with me throughout my life. In closing, I want to say that I am undeniably my father's child, and for that I am eternally grateful. His wisdom, his work ethic, his sarcastic humor, and his unwavering love have shaped me in ways that words cannot fully express. Though he may be gone, his spirit lives on in me and all those lives he touched. He will be deeply missed, but his legacy will endure forever.
Thank you, Larry and Teddy. What has impressed me as well is when I spoke with Gail, and she reminded me that she and Bob were married for 65 years. That's a very high threshold to meet and to compete with, but I'm glad to hear that wonderful number of your achievements. I now call on, as our third speaker, John Bull.
Well, the big news is that I got up here. My heart is very heavy today, although Teddy and Larry have changed it and helped me a little bit. Bob was my good friend for 52 years, and so his memory is vibrant in my mind every minute of the day. He was a very talented man, as you know. He was a true journalist. He was caring about other people. He always tried to help them and protect them and have some advice and kindness to them. He was a lovely family man, as we have heard, and he was always helping other people. And following him closely, he sort of became my rabbi, especially at the Inquirer. Whenever anybody attacked me or whatever they did to object to what I was doing, which we know is several times a day, why, he would protect me and defend me, and he was responsible for my successful career. He was, before I got there, and even after the first few years, he was in charge of the Inquirer newsroom, which just before I got there went through great turmoil because it had been owned by Walter Annenberg, who used it as his personal toy, especially with the state legislator in Harrisburg. And then it was sold to Knight Ridder newspapers, and they sent in new staff people. So there was great turmoil between the older staff people that were Annenberg's friends and the new Southerners that were hired to replace them. And there was always a lot of commotion going on. And yet Bob kept it under control. He counseled everybody. He cooled tempers. He kept things going. And he really managed to run the place very, very well. When I met him 52 years ago, he took me out to lunch to interview me for maybe a job at the Inquirer. He was accompanied by John McMullen, who was then the editor of the paper. And we went to a restaurant on top of one of the big buildings along South Broad Street. I forget what it was called. But we were having lunch, and up came to say hello Frank Rizzo. Rizzo was then the mayor. And it was very surprising to me because in those days, but John McMullen, who was the editor, would have a column in the Sunday paper, and almost every couple of weeks he would write a column telling the world how miserable a person Frank Rizzo was. And yet Frank came up to say hello, and he was obviously a little bit worried about McMullen. And anyway, that went on, and then he left, and I said to Bob and to John McMullen, wow, that was really something. He must really worry about you guys. And the fact that he would come up to say hello is remarkable. Well, Bob said, it wasn't us. He said, he heard you were coming. Anyway, when he ran the newsroom, as you heard, he did have sometimes a bit of a temper. And before I got there, I never saw this, but I was told that he would, if he was really upset about something, he would kick his garbage can. He would go in his office and kick the can. So if you had angered him in some way, you know that he's going to kick your can. Anyway, he ran the newsroom with competence and integrity and professional journalism in a way that few people have ever seen. He did that for a while, and then he ran the features department. He moved over to the other part of the Enquirer. And when he was there, he became interested because he was in charge of the comics in the paper. And he became very interested in comics and became a real expert in them, what they were like. And he got to know all the creators of all the comics in the country. He went to various conventions and eventually became the president of the Newspaper Features Council, which, among other things, controlled all the syndicated columns and comics. And Bob became the expert on that, so when a newspaper wanted to change its comic strips or know whether to hire a new one or keep an old one, they would go to Bob, and Bob, who was then known as the comics czar, would tell them yes or no. And that's what happened. It was quite remarkable influence he had. In his last few years, we sat next to each other in two little adjoining rooms. They weren't even rooms, they were just spaces with a glass wall between us. No doors, no roofs, no nothing, just the two of us there. And so we sat next to each other in that fashion for, 10 years or thereabouts. So I couldn't get away from him, but that was okay because I was following what he did and the way he treated people. And the way he treated me justified my referring to him as my rabbi. And I tried to emulate him in many, many ways, especially the way he treated people and how patient he was with them and how helpful he always tried to be. When he retired, it was a great loss to the paper. And as you see by some of the things out in front of the office, of the room here, he made a big impression on all kinds of staff people. And I was very impressed with that, and I think I learned something from watching it. When he retired, he kept in touch with us. We had a lunch group. There were 5 of us. John Lubell here is one of us. And we went out for lunch every couple of weeks somewhere. And that was one way we kept in touch, especially with Bob. And then during the summertime, he would have a bunch of us over to his house. He and Gail would have us for an outdoor picnic. And then we'd swim in his pool, which after several years, he finally realized he had to have it heated. But even then, he never went in the pool. Gail did it all the time, but Bob seldom went in the pool. But nonetheless, we had wonderful times there for several years, every summer, a couple of times every summer. But that's the way he was. He wanted to keep in touch with us, remain friends, and we wanted to keep the same approach with him. So when he retired a couple of years before I did, it was a great loss to the newspaper and to me personally. But he really became, I gather, what's known as a true Gita Neshama, which I'm told from my Presbyterian church school days means that he was a very, very competent and caring person. And so to my friend Bob, I say, rest in peace, my rabbi.
Thank you, John. Another translation of Gute Neshama means someone who has a good soul, a good basis of who they are, reflected in the words of John Bull. Incidentally, my niece is now working at the Enquirer as well. She's working on the digital version a department that hardly existed in anyone's mind when Bob worked at the Inquirer. But she appreciates and enjoys her work there as well. I'm now honored to call on John Lubell to please join with us here on the pulpits. Take your time. It's pretty steep.
Well, that's a hard one to follow, but I'll try. I met Bob shortly after I got to the Inquirer in 1977, and it was soon thereafter that we realized they had a lot in common, that we both were newspaper freaks. I had been elsewhere for many years, I guess 39 total, in the newspaper business, and we both had Oklahoma ties. I'm an Okie, and Bob spent many years in Norman, Oklahoma, for some reason, leaving the Bronx for the University of Oklahoma. I never quite understood why, but anyway, I think he enjoyed himself out there. And we both liked Maine. Maine is where I spend many happy summers, and Maine is where Bob and Gail retreated most every summers that I knew them. And another amazing coincidence was we worked during our careers for the same newspaper in Westchester, New York. So there was a lot to talk about. We became good friends. And as John Bull mentioned, there was a group of us who had lunch every so often while we were at the paper. He didn't mention the nickname. The nickname was Romeo's, which many of you may know means retired old men eating out. And maybe it was Sally Downey who labeled us as Romeo. I'm not sure. But it was an amazing friendship we had. And Bob, as you have already heard, was an amazing editor. He ran the city room. He was city editor for I don't know how many years. And then when the new regime came in that John talked about, he moved over to features and was a brilliant arts and features editor. And then he was able to do his thing with comics and many of the things John talked about. It was a wonderful time that we had together, but during the time I knew Bob, there was one thing that many of you and many people didn't know, was when he was in Oklahoma, he was a great sports writer and sports editor, and sports was one of his passions. And Oklahoma fielded, in those days, the best college football team in the country. When I was in high school, Oklahoma Sooners won 47 straight games, which still stands as a record. And Bob was editor of a newspaper in Lawton, Oklahoma, nearby, and had a great passion for sports. And so did I. And we exchanged many reminiscences of the good old days with some of the stars of yesteryear in Oklahoma. This is a sad day in many ways, but it's a happy day to remember these things and to remember Bob's influence on so many people. He will be sorely missed, and we're happy to be able to see some people who remember him because he was worth remembering. As I wrote to Gail when she told me, Bob was one of a kind. And one word I can think of that sums him up, and many of you will know what it means. He was a mensch. Thank you.
As a lifelong subscriber to the Inquirer and still currently getting it, I appreciate hearing these reminiscences of the days of yore. I'm going to recite a prayer in a moment that's called El Malei Rachamim, God the Compassionate One. Even in times of sadness and sorrow, we turn to God for strength. I welcome those who are comfortable to kindly stand as I read this prayer. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hamtsei Menucha Nachona Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim Toharim, K'zohar HaRakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmat HaYashar Shalach L'olamo, B'gan Eden Tehei Menuchato, Ana Ba'al HaRachamim, Hasdirehu B'seter Knap Pecha L'olamim, Utzror B'tzror HaChaim Et Nishmato, Adonai Hu Nachalato, V'yanuach B'shalom Mishkavo V'nomar, Amen. O God, exalted and full of compassion, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the soul of Bob Greenberg, who has gone to his eternal home. Master of mercy, we beseech you, remember all the worthy and righteous deeds that he performed in the land of the living. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. The Lord is his portion. May he rest in the tranquility of shalom, of peace. And let us say, Amen. Please be seated. Any potential contributions to be made in Bob's honor are requests to be made to the Gaylord College of Journalism, care of the University of Oklahoma. The exact street address I'm sure you can find online. The ceremony proceeds at the Brigadier General William Doyle Veterans Cemetery, and those who are joining with us will travel together.
We can rise once more, please.
Adonai miyagur bo elecha, mi yishkon bahar kodshecha, olech ta'min b'for tzedek, v'dover emet la'ovo, lo ragal al shono, lo asal lehu ra'a, v'cherpa lo nasa afrovo, v'yitzev einav min'atz, v'yireh Adonai yichaberu, v'yishpal